Ridge Forrester had just concluded an exhausting business trip. His mind was clouded with the weight of corporate decisions and family drama that seemed to follow him wherever he went. It had been a tough few weeks, and all he wanted was to return home to Los Angeles, to Brooke and his family, and to find some semblance of peace after the chaos. As the plane ascended into the sky, Ridge couldn't help but lean back in his seat, exhausted but relieved to be heading home. The familiar hum of the engines was soothing, and he tried to relax, his mind wandering briefly to thoughts of Brooke and their ongoing struggles with the complexities of their relationship. But before he could settle into the comfort of the journey, disaster struck. A sudden, catastrophic event caused the plane to plummet, throwing the passengers into chaos. The world spun uncontrollably, and the final moments of Ridge's flight were a blur of terror and confusion. The next thing he knew, Ridge found himself in the hospital, his body battered and broken, and his mind locked in a deep, unyielding darkness. When the doctors informed Brooke of Ridge's condition, the words hit her like a sledgehammer. The love of her life, the man she had fought so hard to be with, was now lying in a hospital bed, unconscious and fighting for his life. It was hard to comprehend, hard to accept. The idea that Ridge might not wake up, that he might be lost to her forever, was a nightmare too horrific to fathom. Brooke stood by his side, refusing to leave, even as the doctors told her that Ridge was in a coma and that the likelihood of recovery was slim. But as the hours passed and Ridge's condition didn't improve, the grim reality set in. The doctors were forced to have the difficult conversation with Brooke if there was a chance that Ridge might never wake up, and if he did, he could be left in a permanent vegetative state. The decision she was being asked to make was one no person should ever have to face, whether to keep Ridge alive artificially or to let him go. The weight of the decision was unbearable. Brooke had always been a fighter, someone who refused to give up on love, on family, on the people she cared about. But this was different. Ridge wasn't just someone she loved, it was her partner, her soulmate, the father of her children, and the man who had been through so much with her. Their love story was messy, complicated, and full of heartache, but it was also filled with moments of profound connection, joy, and passion. She had spent decades fighting for a future with Ridge, navigating the ups and downs of their relationship, trying to hold on to something that seemed at times impossible. But now, as she sat beside his unconscious form, the future seemed so uncertain, so fragile. How could she decide whether to let him go? How could she make that choice, knowing the consequences would haunt her forever? The emotional turmoil that Brooke was experiencing was beyond anything she had ever faced. She had never imagined being put in a position like this, never thought she would have to choose between holding on to the man she loved and letting him go. But the doctors had made it clear there was a very real possibility that Ridge would never recover. If he did, he could be trapped in a body that no longer responded to the world around him, a shell of the man he once was. Could she bear to see him like that? Could she live with the knowledge that her decision might be what ended his suffering, or might prolong it indefinitely? It was a choice that tore her apart, each moment dragging her deeper into a spiral of despair. Brooke spent days at Ridge's side, the pain in her heart growing with every passing hour. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't think of anything but him. The love she had for Ridge was all-consuming, and the thought of losing him was too much to bear. She replayed their history in her mind, their first meeting, their early years together, their struggles and triumphs, their children, their love. It all seemed like a lifetime ago, and yet it was still so fresh in her heart. How could she let go of all of that? How could she say goodbye to the man who had been her partner in everything, the man who had always been there for her, even when they were at odds? As the days wore on, Brooke became more and more isolated in her grief. She spoke to no one, not even her closest friends or family, unable to share the depth of her anguish. The decision she had to make loomed over her, and every time she looked at Ridge, the weight of it threatened to crush her. She wasn't just deciding whether or not to pull the plug on Ridge's life, she was deciding whether or not to let go of everything they had built together, everything they had fought for. The pain was unbearable, and yet she knew that she couldn't keep him alive forever, not if it meant condemning him to a life of suffering. In the midst of her despair, Brooke found herself lost in a fog of uncertainty. She felt completely alone in her decision, as though no one could possibly understand the complexity of her emotions. She had always been a fighter, but this felt like a battle she could not win. How could she possibly make the right choice when both options felt like a betrayal of the love they shared? The agony of it was unbearable. The love she had for Ridge was as deep as it was unwavering, and the thought of losing him in any form was a fate she couldn't bear. But the alternative, watching him suffer in a state of permanent unconsciousness, was just as intolerable. Brooke spent hours sitting by Ridge's bedside, her mind racing through all the possibilities, all the what-ifs. She thought of their children, of their future, of all the dreams they had once shared. Was it fair to keep Ridge alive, knowing that he might never be the man he once was? Was it selfish of her to hold on, to refuse to let go? Or was it selfish to let him go, knowing that she would be choosing his death? It was a decision that no one should ever have to make, and yet, there she was, faced with it. As the days passed, the pain of uncertainty continued to gnaw at Brooke's soul. She spoke to the doctors, to the nurses, trying to understand the medical realities of Ridge's condition. But no one could give her a clear answer. The medical facts were stark. Ridge's chances of recovery were slim, and the possibility that he would remain in a vegetative state was all too real. The doctors explained that, given his current state, the only option was to make a decision about whether to continue life support or let him go. The choice was hers. But how could she possibly make such a decision? How could she choose to end the life of the man she loved? In the midst of her turmoil, Brooke began to experience a deep emotional and spiritual crisis. She prayed, she meditated, she searched her heart for the strength to make the right choice. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that there was no right answer. There was only pain and the uncertainty of what would come next. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Brooke made her decision. She could no longer watch Ridge suffer. As much as it broke her heart, as much as it felt like she was abandoning him, she knew in her soul that it was time to let him go. It wasn't a decision she made lightly, nor was it one she would ever forget. But in that moment, she knew that keeping him alive in such a condition would only prolong his suffering, and that wasn't fair to him. With tears streaming down her face, Brooke made the heart-wrenching decision to end Ridge's suffering. She knew that, in her heart, she would always love him, always carry the memories of their life together. But now, she had to say goodbye. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, but in that moment, she found the strength to do what was best for him. Ridge Forrester was gone, and Brooke was left to pick up the pieces of her broken heart. The love they shared would never fade, but the agony of this decision would haunt her for the rest of her life. In the complex, twisting world of the bold and the beautiful, where family drama often takes center stage, one truth is becoming increasingly hard to ignore. The trauma suffered by Thomas and Steffi Forrester isn't rooted in the infamous battles with Brooke Logan, but rather in the perpetual emotional neglect and instability caused by their father, Ridge Forrester. For years, fans have watched as Ridge bounced back and forth between two women, Taylor Hayes and Brooke, leaving his children to pick up the emotional wreckage. The story that has unfolded over 3 decades is not one of a man torn between two loves, but of a father who failed his children time and time again, leaving them broken in ways that cannot be undone. This is the untold truth that needs to be acknowledged. Ridge Forrester is the true villain in this story, not Brooke, not the Logans, not even Taylor. Ridge's lack of decisiveness, his abandonment, and his emotional unavailability have left a permanent scar on Thomas and Steffi. It's the story of a father who, in his selfish pursuit of love and validation, has left his children in a constant state of emotional turmoil. The root of the Forresters' pain. To fully understand the gravity of Thomas and Steffi's pain, one must look at the years of psychological and emotional harm caused by Ridge's actions. He consistently failed to provide his children with the stable, nurturing environment they desperately needed. Each time he left Taylor to be with Brooke, he told his children, directly or indirectly, that they weren't worth the effort to stay. He tore apart their sense of security, and with every return, he reignited their hope only to abandon them once again. This cycle of emotional chaos, this constant yo-yo between the women in his life, sent his children into a spiral that would ultimately manifest as the painful dysfunction we see today. Thomas and Steffi didn't just witness their father's choices, they lived them. Every time Ridge returned to their lives, it wasn't with the stability they so desperately needed. Instead, he brought confusion, betrayal, and false hope. They lived through the constant pain of having a father who couldn't prioritize them, who couldn't choose his family over his own desires. As their world crumbled around them, their father remained absent in all the crucial moments. Thomas and Steffi, instead of being able to trust in their father's love and stability, were left to navigate a tumultuous world with little guidance or support. The real villain of the story, so, who is to blame for the damage done to Thomas and Steffi? It is easy to point fingers at Brooke and Taylor, as the show has often painted these two women as the center of the emotional conflict. But the real villain in this saga is Ridge. His indecision, his emotional unavailability, and his refusal to face the impact of his choices on his children have made him the architect of their pain. Instead of being a steadfast presence in their lives, Ridge prioritized his own desires, creating an emotional roller coaster that his children had no choice but to endure. Thomas and Steffi's trauma wasn't caused by their mother's struggles or by the battles between Brooke and Taylor. It was caused by their father's inability to act as a true parent, to provide the love and stability every child needs. Their pain is rooted in the fact that Ridge chose his romantic entanglements over the emotional well-being of his children. Every time Ridge abandoned Taylor for Brooke, he reinforced the message to his children that love, family, and security were not reliable. They watched as their father continuously betrayed their trust. The truth is that Thomas and Steffi's pain comes not from the women in their father's life, but from the emotional neglect they suffered at the hands of the one person who should have been their rock, their father. The illusion of Brooke's responsibility, the narrative around Thomas's anger towards Brooke often gets tangled in the assumption that it's her presence in Ridge's life that caused the chaos. The reality, however, is that it is not Brooke who destroyed the Forrester children's childhood, it is Ridge. By choosing to constantly flip-flop between women, by leaving his children in the wake of his romantic decisions, Ridge created an unstable, emotionally hazardous environment for his kids. Thomas and Steffi didn't just feel the sting of their father's emotional neglect, they internalized it. They became products of a father who made them feel unimportant, expendable, and unworthy of his commitment. In Thomas's violent attack on Brooke, we see a classic case of misdirected rage. He's not angry at Brooke for being with Ridge, he's angry at his father for abandoning him. But instead of confronting the real source of his pain, Thomas chooses to lash out at the woman his father has chosen. He attacks the symptom, not the disease. The truth, however, is glaringly obvious. It's not Brooke's fault. It's Ridge's. The cycle of pain, what we're seeing is the continuation of a cycle that began in Thomas and Steffi's youth. Their emotional wounds didn't begin with Brooke, they began with Ridge's failures as a father. Ridge's inability to provide the stability his children so desperately needed has led to the brokenness we see in Thomas and Steffi today. They're not villains. They're victims of a man who chose his own happiness over the emotional well-being of his children. They are still trying to reconcile the fact that the one person who should have protected them was the one who continually let them down. Ridge's selfishness didn't just affect his relationship with Brooke and Taylor, it irreparably damaged his relationship with his children. And it is this neglect, this abandonment, that lies at the heart of Thomas and Steffi's dysfunction. Ridge's never-ending escape from responsibility for 30 years, Ridge has been shielded from the true consequences of his actions. The show has consistently portrayed him as the tortured romantic hero torn between two women, but in reality, Ridge is not a hero, a man whose decisions have destroyed the emotional fabric of his family. The constant shifting between Taylor and Brooke wasn't a noble battle between two lovers. It was a man choosing his own desires over his children's need for stability. And through it all, Ridge has never been held accountable. He's been allowed to live in the fantasy of his own emotional turmoil while his children have been left to pick up the pieces of a shattered childhood. Thomas and Steffi's anger isn't misplaced, it's a reflection of the pain caused by their father's failure to be there for them. Their emotional scars are not the result of their mother's actions or of the rivalry between the women in Ridge's life. They are the direct consequence of a father who repeatedly chose his own desires over the well-being of his children. The show must face the truth, though. Where does this leave us? The show has continually avoided confronting the core issue: Ridge's failure as a father. The real story here is not about Brooke versus Taylor, it's about a man who has failed his children in ways that are unforgivable. Until Thomas and Steffi stop defending their father and begin holding him accountable for the trauma he has caused, they will never truly heal. The truth is simple: Ridge is the one who destroyed their childhood, and until that truth is acknowledged, the cycle of pain will continue. As long as Thomas and Steffi are caught in their own emotional turmoil, refusing to confront the man who caused their pain, they will never find peace. And as long as Ridge is allowed to continue his self-serving ways, never facing the consequences of his actions, the Forrester family will remain trapped in an endless cycle of dysfunction. It's time for the show to stop shying away from the truth. Ridge's inability to provide for his children's emotional needs has created the brokenness we see in Thomas and Steffi today. The real battle is not about who Ridge chooses as his partner, it's about whether or not he will finally take responsibility for the damage he has done to his own children. Until that happens, the cycle will continue, and Thomas and Steffi will remain lost in the chaos their father created.